train driver blundered through a signal and couldn't escape the consequences. And the tale of another mighty struggle against the sea, when hundreds perished and a lucky few escaped their Titanic in the icy waters.
You were surrounded by bodies and a raging sea. I mean, what more would you want from hell, really? To be dead was nice. Would have been nice. It was the cosiest place to be. Because it was hell being alive, and death was an easy way out.
Since the Titanic sunk in 1912, man's urge to travel ever further, ever faster, has never waned, despite constant catastrophe.
Oh yeah! Oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no, oh no.
The worst such catastrophes occur when not one thing goes wrong, but a series, brought together in a deadly coincidence. There's a technical flaw, often small, and a human flaw, just as fatal. The most dramatic modern disaster was the explosion which destroyed the Space Shuttle Challenger before the horrified eyes of a mass TV audience.
Challenger, go with throttle up.
This catastrophe had eerie echoes of the Titanic.
15 seconds.
Just as the Titanic captain ignored 5 separate ice warnings when he sailed, so America's spaceflight bosses ignored the ice warnings before the Challenger flew. Just as ice brought Titanic down, so did ice expose the errors in Challenger's design. When a DC-10 aircraft cartwheeled to destruction at Sioux City in America, more than 100 people lost their lives. But it took 3 such crashes, one of them the world's worst, before designers and air industry chiefs woke up to the faulty design of the plane's cargo doors. Here in Britain, the air crash at Kegworth in Leicestershire showed the terrible consequences when engineering flaws are linked to human failures, however understandable. The nightmare will forever haunt those who escaped. On January the 8th, 1989, a British Midland Boeing 737 left Heathrow Airport bound for Belfast. Among the 115 passengers were Steve Butcher, a television director, and Chris Thompson, returning home after a business meeting.
Just after the plane had reached its sort of cruising altitude, about 28 or 29,000 feet I think it was, they started bringing out, as they always do, the drinks, the food, and I just poured the wine, and suddenly this huge bang, and the whole plane shuddered.
These first signs that something was terribly wrong came only 13 minutes into the flight.
I could see, because of where I was sitting, flashes of flame coming out of the engine on the left-hand side.
The port engine on the left was vibrating badly. Anxious passengers saw smoke filtering through into the cabin. But there was no apparent need for panic. It was a nearly new plane, designed to fly on one engine in an emergency. The captain shut down an engine. His target was East Midlands Airport, about 10 minutes flying time away. His passengers silently urged him on.
Someone near me later on had said to me, several months later, I had met them and they said that they thought I had been sitting praying. And what I'd actually been doing was sitting talking to the engine, trying to will it on, telling it, come on, you can make it, yeah, come on, you can do it.
But the plane's state-of-the-art instrument panel was also its undoing. The crew weren't sufficiently familiar with it. Unwittingly, they had already made their fatal mistake. One passenger had an inkling of what was happening, but couldn't really believe it.
But I actually did think, that sounds like they'd switched off the wrong engine. And then I thought, no, they couldn't have done. Maybe I've misunderstood. Maybe starboard on a plane is not the same as starboard on a boat. They couldn't possibly have made that mistake.
Steve Butcher's suspicions were tragically justified. The perfectly good right-hand engine had been shut down. By the time the captain realised, it was too late. They were hurtling towards the village of Kegworth and the busy M1 motorway.
It was really on the very final stages of the approach when I really was thinking, we are going to make it, that the vibration started getting much worse.
It suddenly spluttered and eventually died out, but it didn't come back.
And the pilot came over and said, take positions for a crash landing.
The plane then just took us, well, I've described it in the past to friends as like going on a roller coaster when it goes over the top of the sort of the big one, and it just keeps going down, and there's just nothing you can do about it.
When I knew that I was in a dangerous situation and that I really should check that card on the front of the seat just to make sure in case the worst happened, I didn't want to do that in case that somehow made the worst happen. So at the moment when I needed to know what that position was, I didn't really know what it was, and I looked round to see what other people were doing, and quite a lot of other people on the plane were doing the same. There was just an absolute feeling of almost unnatural calm.
You could see the lights coming up. I saw this church spire went by, and then there was a row of trees hitting past the window, and that was actually the last thing I remember apart from enormous crushing, which was actually the trees of the embankment, which were young saplings, and then we actually nosed into the embankment.
Flight BD-092 ended only 100 metres short of safety. The airport borders the M1. Police, fire and ambulance were there within minutes. For the survivors, it seemed an age.
When I came to, I was in complete darkness. I think I must have been underneath a pile of seats. And I was completely pinioned, so I couldn't move. And my first thought was that I was having one of those dreams where you dream you're awake but you can't move. And then gradually I realised that I was awake, and at the back of my mind was something about a crash, but the feeling that it must have been weeks ago. And then very faintly I heard the sound of sirens, and I realised that I was actually still on the plane. And with no idea how long had elapsed, my first thought was that it would be about to go up in flames and I was going to be burnt to death.
Terrified motorists saw the aeroplane hit the motorway, skid across all 6 lanes and break up on the embankment. They scarcely believed the resulting carnage.
Well, first of all, I saw the plane coming over from a distance, coming up the hill. I saw sparks coming from the tail end of it. Then as I come up the brow of the hill, I just saw the last part of it crumpling up.
Just as a few more metres would have brought safety, so a few metres less would have brought the aircraft right down on the motorway traffic. The consequences would have been unthinkable.
If you tell me no motorist died, I don't know how. I mean, there's debris all over the motorway, and the motorway was busy.
Motorway traffic came to a standstill. Several drivers left their cars and helped while the ambulances came. One was Graham Pearson.
And I remember entering the plane and stepping on something soft, which when I sort of like looked down, I realised that somebody had gone through the floor. They were dead and they were just slumped across the floor, and I'd sort of like walked off a hard surface onto this soft surface and realised it was a dead person. And I remember, apologising. Sounds, saying, oh, sorry, but moving on.
Eventually, a fireman said, "It's all right. What's your name? We'll get you out." And I just went on shouting. And it was just a sheer panic reaction, and yet I knew that it was irrational and that my going on shouting wouldn't help them get me out any faster. And at one point I actually stopped shouting and apologised for making all the noise. But I'm just very frightened. And then I went on shouting.
The plane broke into 3 parts. It took rescuers 8 hours to free the last trapped passengers.
I was carried out through a gap in the fuselage. I just thought, this is amazing, all these people have come to get me out of the plane. And then as I went down the slope towards the motorway, I was carried past the place where the roof was broken. And at that point I realised just how serious it had been and how lucky I was to be alive.
The experiences of the rescued were matched by those of their rescuers. Images and emotions would stay with them throughout their lives.
There was a guy who was sat next to his wife on the plane. He was sat there holding her hand, and he basically could feel the life leave her. And at one point, that's the way he wanted to go. He wanted to leave this life as he knew it, and he wanted to go with her. It was only as I came onto the plane and we started talking that he sort of dragged him back from the edge. I remember as the doctor came on, he was sort of like then going round some of the casualties, and he was then saying, well, that person had gone, was dead. Had I maybe sort of helped that person first, or paid them more attention, they may be alive now. That's the bit that really gets to you. And the guilt, it just eats away at you.
37 people were killed immediately. 8 more died later in hospital. 79 survived.
No, I came round in the hospital 2.5 to 3 hours later, I suppose. I'd been unconscious in the wreckage. It took 2.5 hours to get me out of the wreckage. And when I came round, I was lying on the table, looking at the ceiling. At that point, I have no recollection of being a person or what even being alive means. Complete blank. And it took quite a while over the next day or so to sort of realise that that's right, I was in a plane, it's crashed. And the first thought that came into my head was, wow, hang on, that means I'm on the ground. I'm alive, like, I'm alive, that's really special. Wow.
The hell that Chris, Steve and the other passengers endured nearly happened twice more. In both cases, an engine failed on a 737 in similar worrying circumstances. But forewarned by the Kegworth horror, the pilots in both cases avoided disaster. All 3 incidents had a common factor. A fan blade inside the engine had broken off due to metal fatigue. The fan had to be redesigned as a result. Although the eventual crash report criticised the pilot and co-pilot for shutting down the wrong engine, there were mitigating factors. The new instrument layout was deemed to be very confusing, and the pilots had had inadequate training on the newer planes. Even those not on the plane had to live with memories for years to come. Rose Pearson well remembers her husband's trauma.
When Graham came back off of the plane, eventually I found him about half past 12 at night. just looking at him, I knew that there was something wrong. He wasn't the person that I knew that had gone onto that plane. And I remember Graham coming away and looking up into the sky, and the tears just rolled down his face. Because of the lights from that part of the service station, then I could actually see that he was actually covered in blood. And he just looked, I don't know, so lost. And he actually did look lonely. And I went to comfort him, and he pushed me away. I wanted back the person that had gone on that plane. And it took me 7 years to get that person back.
The odd thing about the crash is that I would have to say I wouldn't wish it away. Obviously my perspective on it would be very different if I'd had someone who was close to me who had been severely injured or killed. But I feel it was actually a part of my life, as a part of what goes to make the person that I am today.
The very nature of air travel and the complex technology it involves means that even the travelling public accepts some risks, even though they are very low indeed. But rail travel is such an everyday, commonplace business that we tend to put those risks right out of our minds. Rail travel is just such an ordinary affair. The rail companies of Europe are proud of their record. In Britain alone, 18,000 trains move in a single day. In any 1 year, there are nearly 700 million passenger journeys, but the incidence of disaster is thankfully small. In the last 3 years, for which figures are available, an average of 31 people were killed on the railways. And in each of those 3 years, there were on average 120 incidents a year classified as potentially dangerous to passengers. The trouble is that as tests like this show, when it goes wrong, it goes very wrong. A 100 people were killed in a rail disaster in June 1998 at Eschede in Germany. A wheel became detached from its axle. The train began to sway and finally plunged into a bridge at 120 kilometers an hour. Britain's worst rail disaster in modern times was at Clapham, where 49 lives were lost. The worst and the most controversial. Once again, a single fatal factor was the primary cause, a signal failure. Look closer and find the human error in wiring those signals. Look closer still and find that the electrician who wired those signals was exhausted after working 7 days a week for 6 months. When another commuter train suffered an appalling accident years later at Watford, it was clear that the driver had blundered. What also emerged was that 4 other drivers had previously made the same mistake. Nothing was done. The big city commuter, especially in London, takes the same train every day. The really dedicated can find the same seat opposite the same travelling companion. The train becomes as safe and familiar as the front living room, until danger strikes. This story starts on August the 8th, 1996, when the 1704 train left Euston for Milton Keynes. Among the passengers was Bob DeBell.
It's only a short journey up to King's Langley, so I just settled down to read the paper and did what everybody else does on the train in London and ignored everybody.
The train was about half to 2/3 full when it approached Watford. The disaster came suddenly, with little warning.
I remember the train horn sounding, and then I was flying through the air. It was just a bang like that, and flying through the air. No warning, nothing else. Apparently the train braked, but I didn't particularly notice it braking. I just thought it was slowing down for the next station.
It wasn't a particularly violent one, the first one. But within a second of that came a far more pronounced impact.
From sitting here, I'm passing you where you're sitting and heading for the wall behind you at, I don't know what sort of speed, but it seemed pretty fast. One moment life is normal, the next you're suddenly conscious that you're in a very serious situation. And then it all happens again. I'm flying through the air again. There are people falling over, flying through the air. It happens 3 times.
The commuter train, with 200 people on board, had collided with an empty train just a few hundred yards from Watford Junction. Bob had felt 3 collisions as each time the trains hit each other, their front carriages were thrown off the track, then the next in line hit each other.
Well, after the third crash, it stopped. Then there was a deadly hush. And I had my phone in my hand as I was standing between the seats, and I was dialing 999. And to this day, I don't know how I got my phone in my hand, because before the crash, my phone was in my jacket pocket up on the luggage rack. I couldn't get myself heard on the phone, so I just shouted at all these people to shut up. I said, if you look out there and you could see outside there was a carriage on its side. I said, well, look, people in those carriages, they've got problems. We're all right. Just, let's be quiet. And everybody shut up. They just stopped screaming just like that.
Firemen had to cut through to many victims from the 5 derailed carriages. 73 passengers were injured and a 54-year-old woman killed when she was thrown from a window.
One lady came down the carriage and said she wanted to go to the toilet. And this other chap and I, who were sort of trying to run things, this other chap always up at the front. She said, thank you very much, and she went past and went up. A couple of minutes later she came back and she said, there's no front there. When the rail track chap eventually arrived, he asked to get off the train. He announced that he wanted us all, those of us who could walk, to follow him down the track. And he led us, it must have been about a mile back down the track towards Bushy.
Nobody was talking. That was the interesting thing. We were all walking together and nobody was talking. There was a lot of shock.
What I wanted to do was get home. I didn't want to go to hospital. I didn't want to hang around. I just wanted to get off. We set off. And then we drove past on another road. We could see it. We could actually see the crashed trains quite clearly. And there were firemen on top of the trains with machinery, saws and so on. And that was one of the sort of the funny effects. I could see they're trying to cut their way in. And I thought, well, it's a few hundred yards away across this field. And I was in that thing. But now I'm here and I'm going home. And then I was safe.
Bob DeBell had lived to tell his tale. Another day, another routine trip on the train. Only this time the routine had been shattered. Bob and his fellow passengers had presumed on modern technology to protect them, just like every other day. But this wasn't just every other day. Such experiences have strange after effects. They are rarely forgotten.
On the Monday I decided to go to work. Principle being, if you crash in a car, get back in the car as soon as you can. I went to get my normal train and I just couldn't get on it. I just stood on the platform. Legs wouldn't move. So I stood there for another half an hour. And I got on the next train. And it was then that you got a full, clear picture of the crash site, because the trains were still at the side of the track. You could see the wreckage and the damage done. And I think that's when it started to hit home at that point, because I don't remember getting to work. I got to work and apparently I was in tears, so I went home again.
I took the Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, so I took 4 days off. I was back at work on the Tuesday, and that was important. I think getting back to all the routines of life was important. The other long-term effect is the back problem. Because although it doesn't affect me at all when I'm standing up, walking around or whatever, I can't sit for long periods. I think the thing that helps you get past a trauma like that is actually to have something which does relax you.
A few odd things started to happen. I distinctly sort of remember clearing Sunday dinner, putting the plates away, so I thought. Then I came back and I couldn't understand where the plates were. They were just gone. And they were in the bin. The pans, the plates, the cutlery, I just thrown a lot in the bin. So get them out before anybody sees what's happened, you know. And then that night, I was getting my son ready for bed and I was bathing him. And I put his clothes down the toilet. Washing baskets over there, toilets over there. I mean, it's not as if they're next to each other. I went to the GP, he offered, you know, we spoke about what was going on was post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, I understood what was going on. I could easily understand if you didn't know about these things, you could think you were going mad because you were doing things that were just totally irrational. But knowing is half of the answer. What was difficult to understand was how I couldn't control it.
When the dust settled on the inquests and inquiries, the familiar story of technical deficiency and unheeded warnings emerged again. The driver had ignored a red warning light and braked hard when he realized his mistake. Too late, he was struck by the empty train coming the opposite way. But his mistake was only one of many, so he was exonerated. It was recognized that there just wasn't enough stopping distance at that point. 4 similar incidents had occurred there, and safety investigators said Railtrack had failed to set up proper investigation procedures. A costly automatic stopping system would have prevented the crash. So would the repositioning of a speed limit sign, and that would have cost little or nothing. For centuries, man has loved the sea and fought the sea. Until the last few decades, the oceans have been the principal routes for trade and transport, at the same time linking men and dividing them. Part of the sea's fascination is its power, the same power which overwhelmed the mighty Titanic and many other great ships before and since. This Russian cruise ship foundered in the Arctic. The passengers took to the ice floes until rescue came. Despite the cold, they survived. Fire is as much an enemy at sea as on land, perhaps more so. The cruise liner Romantica caught fire in the middle of the Mediterranean. Again, the worst was avoided. Hundreds were saved. But for most of us, our experience of the sea comes when we take a ferry. And ferries can and do founder. The 2 great sea disasters of recent years have been terrible in their sheer scale and the number of their victims. The Herald of Free Enterprise capsized just outside Zeebrugge with a death toll of 193. The design and safety of roll-on, roll-off ferries came under scrutiny when it was revealed the ferry had sailed with the bow doors open. It was also bow doors which were at fault in one of the greatest maritime disasters ever, only 4 years ago. Every day, a ferry sails between Tallinn, the capital of Estonia, and Stockholm in Sweden. On September the 28th, the Ro-Ro ferryboat Estonia left its home port with more than 1,000 people on board. Among the passengers was a young Englishman, Paul Barney. He was about to endure a night of horror and hardship, very like that suffered by the fated passengers of the unsinkable Titanic.
When I first boarded, I went to see if there was any bunks available, and they said there wasn't, but come back at 7 o'clock when she was leaving. And I went back, and there was one, but I changed my mind at the last moment. I just didn't think I needed to go down into that claustrophobic space. Well, obviously this is quite early in the evening. We're talking about 7 o'clock in the evening, and you've got a whole evening's entertainment ahead of you if you wished. If you went up to the restaurant, there would have been, and the cabaret and everything, there would have been all sorts of other things going on. But for me, I was in for a quiet night.
As the evening wore on, the weather outside grew steadily worse. The Baltic is treacherous in times of storm, and the Estonia soon hit problems.
I was asleep for a couple of hours, and then suddenly there was a sort of, the way I remember it was a sort of banging, and I was alerted to that, and somehow I decided to look around and was disconcerted by a slight list to the ship. As the list increased, furniture started to slide around, and I realised that the ship was actually rolling over.
The Estonia was certainly rolling over. In a nightmarish reprise of the Zeebrugge tragedy, water was pouring in through the bow doors, making the ferryboat lurch ever more dangerously from side to side. Finally, it rolled over completely onto its side.
You couldn't get a worse situation as far as those moments are concerned. I mean, there you were with water gushing into a ship and the lights go out in the middle of the night in the middle of the 60 miles from land. You don't give yourself much chance on that one. Just as I was losing hope, if you like, the moon came out from behind a cloud, a sort of half moon came out from behind a cloud and suddenly lit up this sort of roof ladder work, which in fact was pipe work on the ceiling. Suddenly I was presented with something I could do for myself to save myself, and that was climb this ladder work, this pipe work. And suddenly I was on top of the ship and I was all alone in my socks, and it was the most bizarre place of all in the world. Suddenly I felt elated. I know it seems bizarre that you can be in such a life-threatening situation and yet feel elated. And it was like standing on a massive surfboard with this incredible gale. And I stood there and you think, of all the places in the world, what the hell am I doing here? And it was just like the most lonely place in the world.
Paul clambered along the ship's side and joined a desperate group of passengers trying to launch a lifeboat. But far from reaching safety, he was about to embark on a new, even more savage chapter of his ordeal.
As soon as it inflated enough, people pushing it, we pushed it towards the sea. People jumped into it too early, and it made it very difficult to push. And then as we hit the surf, I jumped in and the life raft turned upside down straight away. So I then had to swim out the door I came in, under the water and out onto the surface of the sea. And suddenly you're into a sort of black ferment of people screaming, and that's just utter chaos and panic in there.
Unbeknown to Paul, he was reenacting another desperate struggle of 82 years earlier. The second officer of the Titanic and a radio officer used deck planks to paddle an overturned life raft clear of the vast lurching liner, its smokestacks smashing lifeboats and sucking others under.
I just grabbed onto the life raft and clambered on board that. I pulled on this Estonian girl, Well, at first I couldn't pull her on. I had to get her home from someone else. And eventually we got, it must have been 16 people on board. And then very rapidly we drifted away as the wind was so strong, just driving everything away from the ship. The Estonian girl was sitting on me, and she was still a bit hysterical. She was still hysterical and crying and sobbing, and there was a lot of shouting of help. I did try and look after her and calm her down. I did my best, but unfortunately when we got torn out of the life raft and came in at a different part of the life raft, and unfortunately she perished on the other side of the life raft.
As Paul and his companions struggled into the life raft, the Estonia finally disappeared beneath the waves. By now it was pitch dark. Mayday signals had been sent, but in the darkness there was no hope that the tiny rafts would be spotted amid the vastness of the Baltic. The conditions in the raft itself were hellish. It was upside down, so there was no shelter from the elements. Constantly swamped by pounding waves, the freezing cold water swirled around and over the half-dead survivors.
I had people who had died earlier in the trip were squeezing me and pushing me, were in the water of the life raft. It was just like you were surrounded by bodies and a raging sea. I mean, what more would you want from hell, really? I mean, what would you expect in hell? Probably that. I don't know. Constantly in fear of your life, and a constant reminder of immortality. And lots of people perished, and there were people perishing. Were dying the whole time. You knew when you saw the sign. You knew if someone was beginning to go. You could see the pattern. People recognised the pattern easily. Height of how people went. It was the same time and time again. To be dead was nice. It was the cosiest place to be, because it was hell being alive, and death was an easy way out. And there didn't seem that much difference between the dead and the living anyway.
6 long, desperate hours later, in the thin dawn light, the rescuers headed for the last known position of the Estonia. The helicopter crews found frozen, terrified people huddled together, fading under the onset of hypothermia, and in many cases too weak to help themselves.
As dawn broke, one of the lads started to go, and I knew that helicopters were coming round, and I just held them out of the water as long as I could. It was a very desperate time, an emotional time for me, because there's a 23-year-old, whatever, 21-year-old lad just drifting away, and I couldn't do anything to save him, and yet I knew, now it was light, that someone would be along. But nothing I could do. I couldn't physically actually hold him out of the water any longer. I was so cold and so hypothermic by then. It's impossible.
The appalling plight of the survivors and the heroic task of saving them were all recorded by cameras aboard the Swedish Air Sea Rescue helicopters. The very rescue was so tricky that these lives were still on a thread.
Well, the first helicopter was an aborted trip. It was a disaster in itself, again with another chap panicking, and the helicopter decided to just get out of there. The frogman being set upon basically came down, the guy was panicking all over him. The frogman panicked himself and decided, right, just get me out of here. It's like being let down into a lion pit, whatever. The frogman went back up, and then they took the bloke with him who was panicking, and he dropped off into the sea.
Paul's eventual rescuers made the next attempt.
It was very bad weather, storming, and it was a heavy rain at that time, so it was rather lucky that we came as close to the raft, so we saw the raft. Had we been at 50 meters away from it, we have missed it all. when I was trying to let the helicopter down, suddenly I just saw a big wave coming just through me, so I have to just put the pitch up, so and the helicopter flies up against. But I was very scared at that time. Then I put the man down, and we started to hoist.
I just remember the wind caused by the helicopter on the water. And just that the wind, the downdraft from the helicopter, just pushing him, the sound of the helicopter. And then Torbjorn, who's the frogman who was sent down, sort of pointing in the right direction, telling me what I had to do.
I managed to get on the raft, and I did my work with my harness and the sling and my guideline, and then it was just to point at the first man, you first, and give him a smile, and then I looked at Paul and pointed to him and said that you go as number 5, and but he shook his head and pointed at the other guy, and I was really amazed. Here's your rescue and you don't want to go up.
You've just seen so much carnage and destruction. I expected the helicopter to ditch. And that's why I didn't trust the next one when it came along either. I said, right, everyone can go ahead in front of me, I'm going to wait and see what happens with this one. Suddenly you put the strop around you and it's like being winched, like beamed up, Fantastic. But you suddenly think, the disaster mentality is still there. I thought, I'm going up so fast, I'm going to just hit that helicopter. Bang. And it wasn't until I was inside the helicopter, on a bench, that I could actually let go. I couldn't actually let go and think I was safe until I was in the helicopter and they cut my clothes off. Fantastic. As soon as I felt I was safe, I could hand over responsibility for my life to them. I seized up completely. My body got cramped, complete cramp, and I couldn't hardly move. I was in total agony.
The helicopter cameras pictured all too clearly the sheer relief, the joy of survival experienced by Paul and his companions.
You don't have any pain? Yes.
When the investigators' cameras went undersea to examine the wreck of the Estonia, they confirmed what the survivors had reported. The waves had ripped off the first shield against the sea, the bow door designed like a visor shield. But that was attached to the inner, supposedly watertight door. This was ripped away like so much cardboard, its locks and bolts savagely pulled off by the sea. The outer door had virtually opened the inner door to usher the elements in. The death toll was never exact. Many children among the passengers weren't fully registered on embarking. But of about 1,000 on board, a mere 137 or so were saved.
There's nothing like the actual euphoria you feel after the next day, and sudden realization that you are alive is one of the most incredible feelings that I've ever felt in my life, really. I've said I really felt myself again about a year ago, when I could really get in touch with and say, hey, that's me, I'm back. And that was really quite an important moment.
Recently, Paul Barney went back to Sweden to visit those men and women who had brought him through his ordeal. It has taken him all the 4 years since to come to terms with the night he lived through his Titanic.
If you survive something like that, I call it a life-enhancing experience because it does make you more aware and more sensitive. One of the things it does teach you is that if you have dreams, then you've got to go for them. There's no point hanging about because they might not happen.
Well, we're going for another of our movie double bills next Wednesday on 5, and that means My Titanic will return at the same time in a fortnight.